Hey, Trifles listeners, just wanted to alert you to something that you should be aware of before Season 5 is out. Just for our Patreon supporters, we have a special bonus episode coming in the month of December. If you are a patron of any level for as little as $1 a month, you will have access to a very special episode of Trifles. It's about Sherlock Holmes in popular culture, stepping a little bit outside of the pages of the Sherlock Holmes stories, but it'll be a topic that we guarantee that you will want to listen to because it's about everything that we love about Sherlock Holmes. Become a patron today at patreon.com/trifles, or just simply go to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com homepage and join from there. You won't regret it. This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 258, Street Lamps. Hello and welcome to Trifles, a Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at some of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, you look like a boulevardier.
Oh, do I?
Yeah.
That must mean I've got a lamp in my hat.
Is that a lamp?
Actually, I wouldn't mind a boulevardier. Would you mix them or should I mix them?
I would love to have one. That'll be a cocktail recipe we can provide in the show notes if folks are interested. If you're standing outside under a street lamp, a boulevardier or boulevardier, depending on how you take your French pronunciation, would be a lovely drink. Quick notes for you. The show notes, if you would like them, if you would like that recipe, are available at ihose.co/trifles258. All lowercase will bring you to that. That'll be on the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site. The show notes specific to this episode. Also, that's where you can hit us up if you'd like to email us, if you'd like to leave a comment, if you'd like to connect with our social accounts. You can do it from there. And just a reminder, our email address is trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. And we do thank those of you who are supporting the show financially on Patreon, also available in our show notes. Just $1 a month or more, depending on what you want to give, allows you to support what we are doing here if you believe in sharing Sherlockian commentary and scholarship. So, thank you very much for that. And now, let's get with the program. Hey, Bert, one other thing I wanted to note before we really jump into street lamps here, jump under the street lamps. You know, it would be helpful if folks wrote to us and gave us ideas for what we're going to talk about next season, in season 6. I don't mean to sound like a Debbie Downer here, but I feel like we're running out of material.
Oh, nonsense. But we encourage people's ideas. In fact, I have been collecting some. I should have told you, I printed some out here. Jane from North Dakota writes, what do you think about the last episode of The Sopranos? Dave from North Dakota writes, I'm having trouble measuring the length of my sleeves for custom shirts. If my sleeve length or actual length is 33 and a half, should I go up to 34 inches or down just to 33? What do you think? And I've got a whole bunch of these things that people have sent me.
Are they all from North Dakota?
Well, apparently many of our listeners are from North Dakota. No.
Okay.
Here's one that I've received from actually somebody in Canton, Michigan, a few streets away from you. Says, Bert, please help me. How can I get out of Michigan? I seem to be trapped here. Your advice is very important to me.
What are my...
Oh, and it's signed... Wait a minute. It's signed Grace.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I was just going to ask you, what are my kids doing writing to you? All right. Well, let's get ourselves out of this. We would love to hear from listeners regardless. I mean, if you do have ideas, if you have a question about something, if you've read something in the canon and you wonder a little bit more about it, we'd be delighted to expound upon it. Give us the littlest trifle and we can spend 30 minutes talking about it at great length.
Well, we've had some great suggestions from our listeners, and we encourage more.
Absolutely. Well, in this case, I was inspired by an article I read in a book put out by our friends at Wessex Press. It's called Occasionally to Embellish, Some Writings on Sherlock Holmes by Nicholas Utekin. And we've had Nick Utekin on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere a number of times, and he has been a prolific editor and a prolific writer as well. And in this case, there is an entry here. There's a lot of entries from the Baker Street Journal, the Sherlock Holmes Journal. This one is called A Light on the Problem, and it's from Shades of Sherlock, number 18, Volume 5, number 2, from August 14th, 1971. Well, I don't know what you were doing around that time, Bert, but I wasn't really doing much myself. So it was nice to see this in book form. And Nick actually writes about the street lamp situation in and around 221B Baker Street. And he uses it as a way to identify approximately where on the formatted, the ordinanced Baker Street is from the maps of Victorian London, because of course in that time Baker Street did not extend up to number 221, and the street was kind of regrafted over the years. So and Upper Baker Street was added. So it's a bit of an exercise, but I thought it might be an opportunity for us to explore what street lamps were. You know, we hear about the editor's gas lamp from the Baker Street Journal. We hear about the ghostly gas lamps failing at 20 feet from Vincent Starrett's iconic 221B poem. So what a great jumping off point for us to explore street lamps and the associated people who were responsible for them in Victorian London.
Yeah, great idea.
Yeah.
Well, and it's true that the lighting in London for centuries, and it is for centuries, had been quite poor. The first requirements for lighting streets didn't happen until the late 1600s during the reign of William and Mary, when people who were householders, and again, now you're talking about people who are more well-to-do, were required to hang a lantern outside their homes or pay some sort of rate towards municipal lighting. And streets were to be lit from the end of September, which in those days they calculated also by Michaelmas. So by Michaelmas to the end of March, which was Lady Day, and from dusk to midnight. So you needed some sort of illumination like that. But it didn't do very much. And as you say, even in Holmes's day, the gas lamps did not cast, much of a glow for any distance, really. Yeah,
and there were a variety of materials that were used for lighting the lamps in those days. They started, I think, with whale oil, if I'm not mistaken, and that of course is expensive. It's also very dirty. And I don't think it was it provided as powerful an illumination as some of the other materials later on. So
No. And whale oil was followed by oil lamps. And once gas lamps came along, they replaced the oil lamps. But that brought its own set of challenges because of those, in those days, you had lamplighters. You had people, obviously, who were paid to go from lamp to lamp, turn on the gas and illuminate it. And it was a tough profession because if too much gas built up before they got it lit, you could put a flame up there and find yourself blown off the ladder.
Well, that's true. And the lamp would need to be replaced as well. The glass would be blown out, etc. So,
yeah. And there's also in America, I just remembered, there's a lovely Chaplin film, a silent Chaplin film that I think is called Easy Street, where Charlie is a constable and he does battle with, I think it's Eric Blore, who is the big bully, sort of the Bluto-like bully in the neighborhood. And the way that Charlie finally subdues him is they bend a street lamp and Eric Blore's head is caught in there and Charlie turns on the gas and he passes out. And then Charlie becomes a great hero. So that's a wonderful old picture.
That's pretty good. I like that. Well, just a little bit more about the history of gas lamps, how they came to use gas and what kind of gas it is too, because, we think of gas today and we often think of propane or, natural gas, liquefied natural gas. But in this case, it's actually coal gas. And since 1667, it was known that coal gas was flammable, but it took 140 years and the Industrial Revolution before they really got to start with using gas for lamps. William Murdoch actually worked at the Soho foundry, and he experimented with different types of gas and found that coal gas was the most effective to burn. And the idea was to be able to have some sort of material, flammable material that could be transported through pipe installations to the place of consumption and lit. And that was the idea. And in 1792, Murdoch lit his house with coal gas. And that's considered the first commercial use of gas and gas lamps for illumination. And it was after that, it was 7 years after that, 1798, that Murdoch then used gas to light the main building of the Soho foundry. And in 1802, he lit the outside of the building for a kind of a public display of the gaslight. And I suppose he really wowed people at that point. So, and from there, it was 1807 where when the first street in London was lit, and it was Pall Mall of all places. So you got to let those government workers stay late, I suppose, and have their walk home. I suppose if Mycroft was there, if he had lived a little earlier in the early 1800s, he would have had his railway lit. He had his rails and he ran on them, and they would have been down there at Pall Mall.
Oh, interesting. Well, of course, and that takes us to the Sherlock Holmes stories where lamps are frequently used not only in atmosphere, but also to set the time. So, for example, in The Second Stain, when Holmes is interviewing a constable about the arrival on a scene by a young woman, the constable says, well, it was just growing dusk at the time, and they were lighting the lamps because he had been sent for some brandy, and then he came back. But also the lamps really help set the atmosphere. So, and of course, there's obviously a great scene. It's very important to this particular case of Sherlock Holmes, I'm sure that we'll talk about. But in the Red Circle, there's this lovely passage because Watson says, when we returned to Mrs. Warren's room, the gloom of a London winter evening had thickened into one gray curtain, a dread monotone of color, broken only by the sharp yellow squares of the windows and the blurred halos of the gas lamps. And as we peered from the darkened sitting room to the lodging house, one more dim light glimmered high up through the obscurity. "Someone is moving in that room," said Holmes in a whisper. Now, where we wouldn't nearly have the magic of that scene without the lamps.
I know. That is fantastic. And, you know, as you were reading that and I was picturing them peering out the window for the light, it reminded me of that famous opening in the Bruce Partington Plans, where it was the third week of November and a dense yellow fog settled down on London. And I have to think that the yellowness of the fog, I mean, it was partly due to pollution, kind of that brown, murky stuff. But as the gas lamps tried to light up the atmosphere, they would have reflected that glow, the glow of the flame and the glow of the tone of the fog as well. So it probably contributed to that fact.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we take a quick break here, have a word from our sponsor, and we'll come back and talk about a few more instances of street lamps and their importance in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Stay with us. In 2021, the BSI Press features 3 new volumes. That's right, 3 volumes, including one from the manuscript series, one from the Professions series, and one dedicated to the outgoing head of the BSI. First, the manuscript series, you'll hear about the Staunton tragedy, that is, the missing 3/4. Mike Whalen, the former head of the BSI, has edited this book, in which a number of authors take aim at the missing 3/4. You'll learn about rugby, you'll learn about the mystery, you'll learn about, well, many things in the latest manuscript series. And in the latest Profession series, Michael Quigley and Marcia Pollock edit this volume that brings together corporals, colonels, and commissionaires as they look at military in the canon. And the third volume is A Quiet Air of Mastery, essays in honor of Mike Whalen as he steps down as the head of the Baker Street Irregulars, and that's edited by Les Klinger. All of these and more are available at bakerstreetirregulars.com under the BSI Press section. Be sure to pick up your copy today. All right, we are back talking about all things lamp-like in the Sherlock Holmes stories. External lamps, street lamps, that is. There are plenty of lamps indoors. Have we ever talked about indoor lighting in the series?
Oh, I think, well, we've certainly talked about it episodically when it features, but I don't know that, actually, I don't know that there's any major, well, it's an interesting subject. We should certainly do some research on that and see if there's a topic there.
Well, I think we've solved for one of our problems that we mentioned up front. That's good. So we were talking about occasions of lamps in the canon. One of the other ones that does play a major part in a plot is in the 6 Napoleons. You'll recall that
yes.
Horace Harker was robbed of his Napoleon. There was somebody killed on the step out. I think that's the house we're talking about. Somebody killed on the steps outside. And then the thief made off with the Napoleon, and he went down the street and he looked for an empty house or an empty garden in which to destroy the bust. And Holmes and Watson and Lestrade are walking along, and they find this place, and he says he says, "I wish to call your attention very particularly to the position of this house in the garden of which the bust was destroyed." And Lestrade looked about him. Well, it's an empty house, so he knew that he would not be disturbed in the garden. Yes, but there's another empty house farther up the street, which he must have passed before he came to this one. Why did he not break it there, since it's evident every yard that every yard that he carried it increased the risk of someone meeting him? I give it up, said Lestrade. And then Holmes pointed to the street lamp above our heads. He could not see what he was doing here, and he could not there. He could see what he was doing there and not there. That was the reason. So, there we go. So, Beppo,
and that's a fundamental bit of insight there from Sherlock Holmes, because this is the first time in the case that we introduce this valuable piece of evidence, which is, he was looking for something inside the bust.
Right, exactly. He had all these pieces, and he needed to sort through them. He needed to see what he was doing. It wasn't a matter of mindless destruction of property.
It's always troubled me, and I suppose I should finish my paper about this, that Holmes's other obvious parallel deduction could well have been, the only conclusion I can come to, Watson, is this fellow also owns one of these Napoleon busts, and he must be missing a nose.
I think we'll leave that there.
And he was clearly, an obsessed ceramic repairman.
He was out looking for work.
No, he was just trying to finish a project. The poor guy. He was probably a member of the gig economy back in Victoria.
There you go. Uber for busts. Well, turning now to the original piece that we mentioned, Nick Utekin's A Light on the Problem. He's looking to see whether or not we could ascertain that a street lamp was near 221B Baker Street. And it's interesting because he sets it up by referring to a paper that Bernard Davies wrote, an argument he made in that paper called The Backyards of Baker Street. And Davies initially was going to use the end papers of 17 Steps to 221B, which was edited by James Edward Holroyd, because those had ordnance maps of London on them from 1895. So how much more authentic could you get? The problem is that the Ordnance Survey authorities had, in their wisdom, thought it necessary to obliterate all traces of street lighting in the 1895 ordnance maps, and Davies had to go back and use the 1872 ordnance maps, which had dots of where the street lamps were on Baker Street. Only on the eastern side, but still, they were located about 40 yards from one another, about 130 feet or so on the eastern side, and the assumption was wherever there were street lamps in 1872, there were also in 1895. And they also noted that street lamps in places like Piccadilly and the Strand were much closer to each other. They were about 20 paces apart. So here Baker Street is in relative gloom, if you think about the spacing of the street lamps. And Nick turns to A Scandal in Bohemia. And you remember that famous scene where Holmes and Watson are getting back to Baker Street. They're unlocking the door, and a slim youth in an ulster goes by and says, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." And we know, of course, that's Irene Adler. Well, that is an iconic sketch that a painting that Sidney Paget did. And we look at the lighting in that, and yes, there's lighting coming out of the fan light from over Baker Street, but there's light on the opposite side of Irene Adler's face. And Nick thinks, well, maybe it's from a passing hansom cab. And then he says, well, they probably wouldn't throw that much light to the sidewalk to light up a face to the degree that Irene's face was lit up. Therefore, there must have been a street lamp somewhere just outside of the frame of reference. Either that or Paget brought his own lighting set to light up the scene before he painted it. So that's one instance. And then, of course, you move across the street to Camden House in The Empty House, and there's a wonderfully detailed description of Colonel Moran. You know, he's there crouching at the window, getting his air rifle set up, and Watson describes his features very well because he can be seen from the light on the street. So we know there must be a lamp somewhere, either on the Camden Street side or on the Baker Street side, approximate to Camden House. And then Nick puts the nail in the coffin when he says, if we look at the pictures from the Golden Pince-Nez, and Watson is showing Inspector Hopkins in through the front door, and what's there over Hopkins' shoulder but a gas flame of a street lamp winking at us. QED. So there was a street lamp outside of Baker Street, and that helps to ascertain in Bernard Davies and Nick's estimation where on Baker Street 221 must have been in the original numbering. That's a lumbering way to go about getting to that conclusion, but street lamps are useful in that fact.
Well, I love that because it's looking at the stories, the characters, the illustrations, all part of playing the game in the world of Sherlock Holmes and saying, hey, look, here's some additional evidence that we need to apply to find the location of this building. But I may have missed this, but are we absolutely certain in looking through those ordnance maps and so on that the physical location, the placement of the lamp has not changed over the years?
Well, they say that at least from 1872 to 95, that it's likely that nothing would have changed. Now, well, I don't think there are gas lamps. Well, there may be one that's been installed in front of the Sherlock Holmes Museum now, but can't say about further down the street. I don't recall any gas lamps still being in existence there.
Well, you see, this is another reason why I really lament the loss of Watson's bull pup from his very first meeting with Sherlock Holmes, where he says, I keep a bull pup, but apparently he doesn't keep him with him all the time because we never see him again. But if Watson actually had a bull pup in Baker Street and there was a lamppost out in front, I'm sure when he was taking the bull pup out for a walk, there would have been cause to make an observation about, Rover insisted, of course, he usually does, upon stopping at the lamppost.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
But why did he choose to destroy it outside this particular house?
It's empty. So he knew he wouldn't be disturbed.
Yeah. But there's another empty house further up the street he must have passed. Why not destroy it there?
The lamp!
By Jove, you're right.